The world is becoming increasingly proficient at telling stories that deny God. As such, we need Thinking Christian to become as natural as breathing. Welcome to the Thinking Christian podcast. I'm Dr. James Spencer. Through calm, thoughtful, theological discussions, Thinking Christian highlights the ways God is working in the world and questions the underlying social, cultural, and political assumptions that hinder Christians from becoming more like Christ. Now, on to today's episode of Thinking Christian. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I am joined today by Helen Cepero, and she is the author of Christ-Shaped Character, Choosing Love, Faith, and Hope. She also started the C. John Weborg Center for Spiritual Direction at North Park Seminary and now does spiritual direction and formation at the Journey Center in Santa Rosa, California. So just welcome you, Helen, to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm good. Good. It's
Very
great
cool
to be here with you.
Well, I thought a good way to just kind of start off our conversation here before we dive into the book is to talk a little bit about something that people might not be as familiar with, which is spiritual direction. So what is spiritual direction? What happens during spiritual direction? And then maybe how did spiritual direction inform the way that you ended up addressing the topics that you address in Christ-Shaped Character?
Interesting. Well, spiritual direction is kind of a misnomer, because I don't direct anything in spiritual direction. I would actually call it a form of prayer, but in a dialogical way, that the Spirit, we're both listening for the Spirit, but I set aside my life so that I can attend to the other person's experience and listen carefully. And of course, I've done this for 25 years. So I'm listening for certain things, certain themes that I know that are often will open up the person's experience to a deeper sense of Jesus with them, or of God with them, or of the Spirit with them. Or actually, well, yeah, for the most part, that's right. Once in a while, I'll see somebody who's not a Christian, and it becomes then this broader sense of the universe, of this transcendence that they can't quite articulate, but they're longing for. But very often, but that's the usual way. And I think when I explain it biblically, you have the Old Testament experience of Samuel being called to Eli. And I know Eli was a bad father, but he was a good spiritual director. And he said twice, I hear you. I hear something. And then the third time, which is 3, is also always the jar. Eli says, that's the Lord. And you need to attend to it. Yeah. And he is a fine spiritual director for Samuel. And I think on the New Testament, I often point to those experiences after the resurrection, where there's certain ways when Jesus speaks, when the very mournful, grief-stricken Mary thinks he's a gardener, but hears her name. Then she goes, oh, it's Jesus, and it happens in different ways in those stories. They tend to be feeling based in the resurrection. There's almost as if it's their depression, their fear, keeps the presence of Christ, which is with them, unable to see. So I don't know if that helps, but
I think so. I mean, as I think through, and I've done I participated in a spiritual direction class. So I taught for a group called Right on Mission, and they asked me to come in and demonstrate with their spiritual director how spiritual direction works for students. And so I had one session. And so I have that experience, but I'm wondering if that's normative. So, how often do you just sort of let people talk versus prompting them to reflect in a particular way? I mean, I would imagine there's a real tension between prompting them to attend to Christ and the Spirit versus pushing them in a direction that maybe they're not going.
That's a really good articulation. There's kind of a fork in the road, and
Yeah.
you have to listen very carefully for when to speak and when not to speak. You know, I don't know if an example helps, but I think that's true. And we all have a tendency toward either teaching or fixing, and mine happens to be more teaching. And I'll meet with somebody and I'll realize I've gone into a teaching mode. It's usually with a question,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
And because a question is very directive, you know.
Right. So what you're saying is,
and I had a teacher once in spiritual direction many years ago who said, she was wonderful. She said, "Don't forget, Helen, that a question is always a shout." And I have to kind of pull myself back and go back to the very last thing that the person said. So it really is a way of listening more than it is prompting. And when we've taught spiritual direction, we usually begin with a group where you listen to somebody's story, but you're not allowed to ask questions. You can only reflect on what people say. And that really puts teachers and pastors and psychologists off their game.
I believe it.
Which is great.
Yeah. I mean, I think I sort of saw that coming out of the chapter on hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
I believe you talk about there the practice of the prayer stick and
Right.
this sort of trading back and forth between one another. And so the way you're describing that, that's where my mind goes in the book, to that chapter on hospitality. There's something about welcoming the other that almost requires listening and acceptance. Maybe not without a view of correction or movement or exhortation or those kind of things, but that initial focus on this is about sort of, I hate to say self-discovery because I don't really think that's what it is. It's more of a discovery of the work of the Spirit in your life, a recognition of that. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
That's fair. And it's usually underneath. I have a funny story about a listening stick story that I can tell, but I don't want to take too much time. But a woman I didn't know, I did a formation in Alaska with someone, and we were in a group and we were doing the listening stick. And I was sitting with someone who I didn't know, and I went in and asked a question. And the question I asked was, "What makes you sad?" And while I couldn't respond to it because it was her next 5 minutes, right? And she listed everything that made her sad. And then she started to talk about the mountains in Alaska and puppies. And I realized that she had moved through sadness to something else.
Yeah.
My friend who knew her really well said, when you asked that question, my heart sunk, because she's depressed all the time. But there was something about listening long enough so that she could get it all out and then hear, actually, there's more. There's more here.
There.
And I'm sitting with you because I'm longing for this more.
Yeah.
And it was a remarkable moment. So I remember that often, because underneath even what are often disordered desires are things, longings, and all kinds of things that may not be on the surface.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think about. I've had several guests on now who have talked about the biblical practice of lament. And it strikes me that story kind of, it gestures toward lament. Like that lament really does open up this sense of hope and corrected desires. Maybe it's purifying in a way.
Yes.
And so it's sort of fascinating.
It is fascinating. And I think that identifies the role of the spiritual director, which is the traditional name of the companion or whatever you want to call it, as witness. Because you have to witness a lament without your tendency is to want to either fix or help them to see that there's light behind that black cloud or whatever. And,
Right.
true lament, your role is to witness, and you don't know when it's going to end.
Yeah. Yeah. We have such a tendency to want to correct what's wrong, either correct what's wrong or correct what is perceived to be wrong. In other words, I'm not even sure why you think you should be lamenting about this.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So fascinating. I love that. Spiritual director's role is one of witness, just to see what the Holy Spirit does through this interesting interaction of speaking and listening, communicating and listening. Love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that gives clarity. And I think, some of the, one of the endorsements I read on your book, as I was kind of reading through your book, and then I was looking to see what other people had said about it. One of them said, it's not a book, it's a conversation. And so I think that's an interesting way. When you do read your book, it doesn't feel like you're teaching necessarily. It does feel like you're drawing someone into a conversation. So talk a little bit maybe about how you think did spiritual direction sort of influence the way that you wrote Christ-centered, Christ-shaped character. Sorry.
I think it's sort of woven into that. It's actually on the beginning of each chapter starts with my personal experience, and with an experience from my life, and then it goes into what the meaning is, and then some biblical stuff, and then possibly I think there's usually a practice, and then an ending, but it always starts with my experience. Calvin said you can either start with God or you can start with knowing yourself. And for spiritual direction, it tends to be not about knowing, but about this kind of knowing of oneself. So I mind those stories.
Yeah. And a lot of it is about the stories. I find that a lot. Even the biblical passages that you quote. Now, there's obviously not all stories in there, but a lot of what you do quote are the biblical stories. That narrative, sort of leaning into the narrative theology of the scriptures to illustrate how this would work,
Right.
how these various aspects would look, which is fascinating to me. So there's a point in your book, and I'm gonna read a quote. And I don't expect you to remember. A lot of times when I interview authors, I'm more familiar with their work at this point than they are because I just read it. And
well, I
so there you go. There you go. But you talk about this idea of here's your quote. It says, "Trying to please God rather than live as God's beloved in Christ leaves us dependent on our own effort, our own striving toward our idealized picture of ourselves." And so I read that, and I guess my question is, how do you work and navigate that fine edge between the necessity of putting forth some effort and some discipline in our lives to sort of realign us and move us toward Christ versus recognizing that effort is not what reconciles us with God or draws God's favor?
Because ultimately, none of those practices will save you. None of them are salvific, right? They're all about just putting you Godward.
Yeah.
And if they don't work, you toss them out. When I used to teach prayer practices, I'd always teach at least 3, because some of these are not going to relate to you. So the narrow place is this, the idea that the point is to turn your life Godward. It's not about doing. I grew up in the Reformed tradition where we talked about faith all the time, but it was all about works. And spiritual direction was amazing to me because it wasn't about what I did. It was about who I am. And my being willing to own who I am, my experience, my longings, my longing for God, it wasn't about what I could do. It didn't. It was that's just empty works. And I don't know. It's a tricky thing to turn people toward. I mean, that is a narrow thing. People come wanting answers, and even the book doesn't give an answer.
Right. When I found it hard. Yeah, I wrote a piece on prayer at one point, or I talked about it on a podcast. I can't remember. They get a little confused, but I've always had trouble with prayer.
Uh-huh.
I was trained as an academic. I'm kind of a huge geek, right? I can read and write all day, but you ask me to pray, it's like, it's not my language. And so one of the things that I started to do was to read prayers written by other people.
Right.
To then start writing out my own prayers, like actually sitting down and sort of leveraging that tendency I have inside of me to try to articulate in a prayerful way. And then ultimately allowing that to grow into something that was a more vibrant prayer life. But, I think there were comments on that episode and that piece that were like, this is salvation by works. This is, these practices are off kilter. And I can understand why people say that. I don't agree, but I can understand why they say that, because it's an easy step from putting forth the effort and the discipline to gain proximity to Christ, right? To really sit in Christ's presence. It's a close step to doing that versus doing these practices as a substitute for Christ's presence.
Right. But if study is the way that you experience God, then I would expect you to craft words that actually kind of formulate how your experience of God is. There's a book by Padre Otuma, which you've probably heard of. He's a poet, called Being Here. And he's written collections of poetry, and I listen to his podcast. But a very small book he has called Being Here explains how to write collects. And it's so interesting because if he is a word person, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he wants to help you pray. So he's telling you, here's a collect I wrote, and you can write this collect. You can say, this is who you are, God. This is what I long for. It's like a 4-step thing. And it's so great because you're still experiencing your inner self at the same time while you're putting it into words. And now you have it. Yeah. Which for people for whom study is not something that matters, they necessarily have it. They might need to go to centering prayer every day, say, and just sit in the presence of God, or do breath prayer. But how great is study as a way? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, like when I read, I think it's in the first chapter, you talk about the breath's prayer. I was like, this is a completely foreign experience to me. Like, I'm not sure I could ever envision myself doing this and really loving it. Feeling it deeply in my core. It's not that I'm closed off to it. It's just, it's one of those things where you tend to get usually I illustrate it like this. Like, I've always been involved in weight training, and I've been just sort of a gym rat since I was 14. And so it's the difference between me going to the gym to lift weights versus me going to do Pilates. Right. I'm open to both, but I have a heavy preference toward one rather than the other. Right.
But you see, I'm a swimmer. So for me, swimming is that repetitive. So I can, I actually find that the quiet prayer, sitting, like using the word in Christ recently, just in Christ, this is where I live, and this is where I swim, and this is my life. So it's so different. I'm very different than you, But
Yeah.
I don't say to people, oh, this is what I do. This is what you should do. That
Right.
never, ever occurs to me. But
Yeah.
if, yeah, but if you do write prayers, there's a new Black author named Cole Arthur Riley, and she's a wonderful writer. And she wrote a book called Black Liturgies. That is her writing. But I think it's better to write your own. And that's why I like the Padre Otuma.
Yeah.
Small book, write your own collects. They only have to be this long.
Right. Well, let me ask you another question, because when I read the first chapter of your book is on, sort of embracing love, about recognizing that you are God's beloved.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions I had for you was, in your experience, do you find that when people are sort of embracing that identity, that they find it difficult to disassociate what they might consider to be prosperity or comfort from being beloved of God? So in other words, our experiences don't always lend themselves to, people go through rather traumatic things.
Terrible.
And so, sort of navigating those experiences, but also holding to this idea that we are beloved of God. Do you find that to be a tension point in that conversation?
It can be. It can be. So often people come to me looking for the presence of God. So they often come in a lost place. Not often,
Okay.
not always. But, I've experienced this trauma, or my daughter has this. And then love seems so far away, right?
Yeah.
But I know what you mean about the prosperity gospel. If people are really into that, spiritual direction is not their thing, because
Yeah.
it's just Kate Bowler talks a lot about, and the prosperity gospel can enter so insidiously, not about money necessarily, but about blessings and about all kinds of other things in our faith life, so that somehow we failed because we're suffering or there's trauma. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it does. I was just, I was struck. I'll be honest. I teach a Bible study on Wednesday mornings, and one of the questions a few weeks ago, we were looking at Romans 8 and the idea of suffering. And what came up was, what is going to keep us from sinning in the new creation? Really interesting question, right? And so I said, I don't know that I want to give the surest answer possible, but the best I've got is suffering. Because we've so experienced the negative, the positive is going to be that much richer to us. And so we will come through refined through the suffering, and then be able to embrace all that God has given us and recognize it as good. And that was the best I had.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I remember reading about a group at George Fox College who were working in spiritual formation with undergrads, and they got together as a faculty and said, what helped us to move forward in our faith? And almost to a person, it was suffering.
Yeah.
It was something that had happened. It didn't have to be this kind of suffering, but it was some loss of a friendship. It could have been a betrayal. It could have been all kinds of things. It wasn't prosperity that caused them to move forward and closer to God.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. And they said, well, we can't do that with undergrads. We can't. But I experienced meeting with a lot of seminary students, and in every age, people suffer certain ways, and being in the suffering is important as well as the goodness of God.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think the chapter I probably resonated with most is the hospitality chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the hospitality chapter dovetails so well with the forgiven as we are forgiven chapter.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was my
So
hardest one to write.
I believe it. I mean, I think as I was reading them, the question that kept coming to my mind is, do we really practice hospitality in the way that you're describing it in the church? I think, we've sort of boiled it down to just maybe taking a meal to someone who is in need of a meal or something like that, and almost an act of service, but not as sort of fully orbed embracing of this other as other. Is that you just talk about that a little bit? And like, what do you see? Is that an appropriate or a yeah? Is that an appropriate observation? I guess.
It would be my observation. I think that's why people come to me often for direction, because they go to church and they don't feel seen. And I wish I had a nickel for every time somebody said, "I don't feel seen there."
Yeah.
You end up going back to, um, Bible's kind of my second language, but the first name for God in the Bible is by Hagar, who says he's the one who sees.
Mm.
And what does it mean to be seen? I don't know, but I don't sense that happening so much at the church, at
Yeah.
church. Um, but I just went back to Alaska for a week, and some of those people are in the church that my husband was pastoring, and some aren't. The people that I saw, but I was telling a friend, I just feel really seen there
Yeah.
for who I am, for what I have to give,
Yeah.
and they're willing to be seen with me, and that's incredible. And it isn't spiritual direction
Yeah.
necessarily. It's this, oh, I can companion you where you're struggling, and I can be with you in this joy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't experience that. It's much more superficial, it seems to me,
Yeah.
often in the church context. I don't,
It,
maybe it's different in a small group. Maybe you experience something else.
I don't know. It was interesting to me. I interviewed a guest who is the lead pastor of a church, and she said that she doesn't preach on Sundays. That in lieu of preaching, they bring someone in to do a prayer of lament, and that is part of their overall discipleship strategy, is sort of reconnecting in that way and giving other people voice to really recognize the ways the world shouldn't be, and allowing other people to be, she didn't use this language, but I will, heard in that context.
Sure, right.
And so it's almost as if a case could be made, I'll say, that the structure of the way we do church, the cadence of it, doesn't lend itself to being seen. It lends itself to watching.
Yes, that's right. It lends itself to being a consumer of whatever is going on up there. But I wouldn't say that about every church.
Agreed.
And I do think every service needs to have a point of lament, because there's always people suffering. So
Yeah.
whether that comes in prayer, whether that comes at the church I attend, at the end of the service, there's the person says, who has a prayer request, and people come up to the mic and they talk about. I mean, it just needs to be
Yeah.
there somewhere, because there's a huge crack in the world,
Yeah.
and if we can't acknowledge that somehow, but also joy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was the other emphasis, just to give closure to that. She did say, they focus on lament and celebration, lament
Mm-hmm.
and worship. And so those are two sides of the same coin in their church, which I loved. But I do think that it almost having that lament, because it's a stranger practice for us, it teaches us to listen in ways that we otherwise wouldn't.
Right, right. And sometimes it's embarrassing,
Yeah.
like, oh
Yeah.
no, is this person getting up again?
Right.
But
Oh boy, here they come. Yeah.
boy, here comes
Right.
Frank. I mean, and I've thought about that, and then thought, no, let's Frank needs to say this today.
Yeah.
And he needs to have a personal prayer about it,
It really is, it does require sort of a radical otherness. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
my wife and I just went to the orientation session for my son. He's going to college, and so we went on orientation. And
Oh.
I've been involved in higher ed for a long time, kind of like you have. And so, to me, so many of these things are just I'm like yawning. I'm like, aside from not being at this institution, I could basically give this conversation like I've heard
Mhm.
it a million times. And then people start asking questions, and in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, please stop asking these questions. And because like, how many times do I have to hear this? But that's a very, once I sort of step back from that, I realize, look, these people haven't been in higher ed for millions of years. They don't understand what's going on. And this is a legitimate question for them. They're not talking to hear themselves talk. They have a legitimate desire to understand what's happening, and they need this. And so that kind of calms me back down. I won't say I still love orientations, but it does remind me, it's like, yeah, just because you know this doesn't mean that they do.
Right.
And we have to leave that room. But it is a radical acceptance of otherness to not
Yeah.
just be annoyed when people are asking or doing things that you're just like,
Right.
oh, yeah.
I had quite a number of years ago now, but someone I'm in touch with again had was carrying a child that she knew would die and decided to carry it to term.
Okay.
That her decision. She didn't come to me about the decision, but she stopped going to church then because there was no room. And when she went to church, they wanted to pray for healing. And the way she heard the voice of God from the doctor who said, your child has this syndrome where his kidneys are not developing and they're not going to develop. And he'll be healthy while he's in the womb, but then the child will die. And so no one in that church heard her say that, but she said it. And well, there was just no room for that kind of tragic choice, right?
Yeah.
I don't know whether I would have made that choice, but she did.
Yeah.
And that's an extreme one. But the orientation one is very good because these people are facing trauma with their kids leaving.
That's right. That's right.
And they have to ask all the questions.
Yeah.
So they can let go.
Well, I will say, I mean, it resonates with me. I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, my son, when my wife was first pregnant, there was a misdiagnosis that my son would be born with a genetic disease. And so that was very early on, and we had to wait for an amniocentesis. But I mean, in the interim, we're sort of in limbo. And so I called a friend just to kind of tell him what was going on, ask him to pray, those kind of things. And he told me, he said, you need to, during this time, you need to mourn the life of the son that you thought God was giving you and embrace the life of the son that God is going to give you. Probably the best advice anybody's ever given me. And just thinking about it, it's like, my son and I are very different. Like, we have very different interests. In a lot of ways, we're the same, but very different, And so I think, had I not had that moment where God shook that picture of what I thought my son would be, I would have had real problems with my son growing up. I would have tried to force him in that mold.
Into a mold, right?
Yeah. But in being able to mourn something that didn't even actually happen, like he wasn't born with a genetic disease, but in being able to mourn that idealized picture, it gave me then release to accept whatever God gave as a blessing. Just
because
some of the best advice I ever got.
That was your job all along as a parent.
That's right.
Him just as he is.
That's right.
I once, there was a friend of mine who had a child who was born with Down syndrome. And somebody said, well, you're called to the discipline of hope because none of the child may not follow the genetic markers, that my children or your children have. But after having kids myself, I'm like, we're all called to this.
We're all called, yeah. Exactly.
For months and years at a time, we're called to the discipline of hope.
No, absolutely. Well, part of what you're doing in the book, you're talking about choosing hope. And so I guess maybe one of the chapters I really enjoyed was watching for God.
Mm-hmm.
And so talk a little bit about that and how you would counsel people to really watch for God. How do they start paying that attention?
Well, I'm going to use you as an example. You pay attention to the fact that you enjoy study
Sure.
and you start to write your prayers. I will, but watching for God is, you don't know. I think I use the illustration of the Iditarod, and you don't know what's on the landscape. You think you do. You dress with what you hope will be there, but you're so things like wonder and surprise and lament and things about the body, which we don't often consider. I feel this knot in my stomach whenever I talk about this, or when the pastor speaks to me, I feel invisible. A metaphor maybe. Going deeper into those things, and I'm a word person. So if you give me a thick word like invisible, I'm off and running. Tell me not so much to ask a question, but tell me more about that. I want to know about this. Why this word? Or yesterday somebody used the word permission, and I'm like, oh, such a great word. It could be freedom. It could be lots of different things. I don't know for sure, but tell me more, because I can go deeper in that and know that we'll be on safe ground almost with a word like permission or recognition.
Yeah. One of the passages I've been reflecting on a good bit lately has been the passage in Philippians where Paul talks about God being able to do abundantly more than we could ever ask or think. And so as I was reading through this chapter on watching for God and just thinking through the concept, those things that you just listed, surprise, lament, all these different areas, it strikes me that oftentimes what it means to pay attention to God is watching for something that doesn't fit our experience.
Oh.
And instead of condemning that and pushing it away, looking at it and saying, perhaps this is a moment when God is doing abundantly more than I could ever ask or think.
I'll give you a biblical example of that, which I love. And that's John 21, where Jesus says, have you caught any fish? And the disciples could do all kinds of things. They could blame the water. They could blame the night. They could blame the weather. But they say, which is the moment of honesty, right? They really show up. And then Jesus tells them to do something silly, right? Throw the net on the other side. And they do it. I mean, if that's the beginning of discernment, discerning God's presence, throw the net on the other side. I'm willing. I'm at a dead end here. I'm going to try. I heard something new. Yeah, you're right. That willingness to stop.
Yeah. And really consider that just because my expectations haven't been met doesn't mean that God is there. That maybe this is a moment where he wants to expand my expectations and surprise me and do something different.
Or maybe I've been looking. One time somebody said, you said to find a place where I feel like I can be with God. I thought it would be far away, but it was really just about turning the chair in my living room towards a tree. And once I sat down and looked at the tree, I thought, oh, is that all? Is that all I needed to
do? There's a fascinating way in which, and I think this sort of permeates your book overall, there's this fascinating way in which the mundane events of life become more profound. At least they contain the potential for a profound understanding of who God is. And for a people who, and I would say for me personally, who are sort of enamored with the bigger things, right? I think being humbled back down to, no, it's the mundane moments of life, those little things that you should be paying attention to, that often we dismiss or just power through. There's a contemplativeness to it that I think your book really emphasizes.
Well, that is what contemplation is, right? I'm not contemplative in the sense of being a quiet person, which I tell everybody who sees me. I'm kind of talky. Uh, I'm not, but contemplative as a core means with God. And it is so often in the mundane that that things can open up, and there's mystery there. And I'm always on the hunt for mystery, because if there's mystery, then we're close to God. Because I can't define God, but I know that if you're sitting in mystery, we'll be close by.
Yeah. Well, hey, I know we're getting close to time, and so I like to close with all my episodes with this question. What do you think that Christians should be thinking about so that they can be more faithful disciples of Jesus Christ today?
I think it's very close to what we just talked about. Okay. I think it's very close to knowing that God is in the tension between the crack in the world and the hope of the world, right? That's what Miroslav Volf talks about, that tension between the crack and we live in that. That's our space. But God lives there too. And to be alert to, if I could rename my book, I would rename it Alert to God's Presence, Alive to God's Love. To me, that's the heart of discipleship. Alert. And so very often when I meet with people, I'll say, well, we're just going to start with, I'll pray us in. And I say, keep us alert to your presence and alive to your love. To me, that's the heart of it. And it isn't about a certain practice. It's not about one particular thing. It's not about if you can study or it's not about, it is about, because it's happening all the time.
Right. Yeah, like study might be a way into it.
Oh,
but it's not the way into it.
Not the way.
Worship might be a way, but it's not the way. Like that kind of idea. Yeah.
And it isn't a certain kind of worship even that makes, but worship may well be a way in. But it isn't everybody's way.
Right.
And if you're a parent, then I expect to hear about your experiences of a father or a mother. If you're a teacher, that's where God is going to meet you. If you're if you're retired like I am and coming toward the end of your life, then maybe that's where God is going to meet you.
Yeah.
It's not going to be in someone else's life, someone else's plan.
Yeah. I love that. Alert to God's presence. Say it again. Alert to God's presence.
Alert to God's presence and alive to God's love.
And alive to God's love. Alert
That's
to God's presence
and alive to God's love. This book, but they said, no, you signed up for character. I said, it's not about character. It's about being alert to God's presence and alive to God's love. Well, I don't like that.
I will be dead honest. When I read it, I was like, I can kind of see characters, sort of, but also not really at all.
So, but if I had made it alert to God's presence, alive to God's love, it would have sold better, and it would have. That's what the book is about.
Yeah.
And I'm not keen on the word discipleship because we usually use it as a way of head knowing, and that's a way of knowing, and I don't discount that at all. But it's not the only way.
I definitely agree with you on discipleship. I'm less I'm not so much opposed to it, but I do think it needs to be reformed and rehabilitated because I think it is much more closely related to mimesis or imitation.
Mm-hmm.
And that involves so much more than just, hey, I know this stuff. I've been sort of enamored with John Vervaeke's work on the 4 Ways of Knowing. I don't know whether you're familiar with John Vervaeke. But it's a fascinating, he does propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory, all these different ways of knowing. And so as we think through those 4 ways of knowing, I think we have an interesting paradigm for discipleship that keeps us aware. And so even the way I would, the geek way I would sort of rephrase your alert to God's presence and alive to God's love is recognizing God as infinitely more relevant than any other actor or factor we will ever encounter.
Oh, I like that.
And so that's drawn out of that sort of Vervaeke paradigm. And that's something I resonate with a lot of what you're saying, because I think it so dovetails together. This idea of recognizing that God is more relevant than anything else we're facing is really crucial. So,
right.
Well, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been great. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully you did too.
I did. It was great fun. Thank you, James. Really
Very good.
Fun.
Well, if I can encourage listeners to go out and get Christ-shaped character, despite the necessity for a title change, I'll put the link in the bio. And
they can change the title. It was never going to sell under character anyway, so because it wasn't that.
Well, the link to it is in the bio, and I'd encourage you to get it off the IVP website. They give me a 20% discount code, and so that'll be in the show notes as well. Please go check out Helen's work. You have one other book, correct?
Right. I have a book on
journaling, yes,
as a spiritual practice, and that is one that I've used a lot as a teaching tool. So if you're looking for something that's not so much about journaling, again, misnomer, it's more about using journaling as an accessible pathway to formation, to learning about.
And I'll link that one in the bio as well, just so you can be familiar with Helen's work. But thanks so much for being here, Helen.
Okay.
Really appreciate it to be on, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Thinking Christian. Just want to take a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on the Thinking Christian podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
But Jesus drank wine. If that line has ever been your justification for another pour, you're not alone. I'm Mead. And I'm Christy. We're two retired overdrinkers turned freedom from alcohol coaches. And on our podcast, But Jesus Drank Wine, we get real about what held us back, what helped us break free, and the sneaky stories about alcohol, about ourselves, and about God that kept us stuck. If you're a Christian woman wondering if your wine habit is worth rethinking, then this is your place. Follow But Jesus Drank Wine on your favorite podcast app or on lifeaudio.com.